course, we know what the deal is. Everybody's optimistic. Everybody likes their team. Everybody fill in the blank. Uh, it is like spring training in baseball or pick your sport. There's always going to be optimism. But did you come out with anything of meaning through all of it with Brent Venables and the players?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of good stuff that came out of it, Mark. I mean, just interesting to see. I think just the metamorphosis of Brent Venables in terms of how he has presented himself, presented his program since day one to how he was this week at SEC Media Days was interesting. I mean, I think the one critique of of him that he's had just in terms of his speaking appearances and that he started from is he tended to go a bit long. Right? I don't know that I would necessarily say he rambled, but he would tend to go on and on and on. But that was not the case this week. He was I believe there was, I can't remember. I think it was Hugh Freeze may have been the one that did not speak as as long. But Brent Venables of all of the coaches, besides Hugh Freeze, spoke. His opening statement was the shortest of all. So which I think was very interesting. But just kind of taking some of the comments he made, Mark, it seemed like he was trying to kind of toe the line between having immense respect for what the SEC is going to bring from a challenge perspective, but also having confidence in his team, having confidence in what they're going to be doing heading into the SEC. I think one of the quotes that he'd said that we're running into the SEC, we're not tiptoeing in, we're not um, we're not nervous, we're not scared, we're not intimidated about coming into the SEC, which I think is a good. You've got to be able to toe that line between not coming in here and then wide-eyed and intimidated, but also respecting the challenge that the SEC brings versus where Oklahoma has been in the past. So I think that was good just from his perspective. I don't know if this is, it's probably not newsworthy at all. It's kind of silly, I guess, but there was a lot of talk about horns down being a penalty. The Big 12 has been pretty clear over the last few years that that it was gonna be a penalty, and then um, it was essentially stated by the lead official there at the SEC that unless someone just really gets up in someone's face and is doing it, they're not going to call a penalty on it. It's just going to be fair game, which I love, and not just from an Oklahoma perspective. Alabama did this, I think, after the game after they beat Texas a couple years ago. So I think it's cool to see that we're not taking things too serious. It's still a fun game at the end of the day. But I think just I guess the biggest sentiment that I would say that I think there's a lot of skepticism in terms of Oklahoma at the line of scrimmage. I know Saban mentioned it a couple of times. Just how's Oklahoma going to be able to compete at the line of scrimmage, particularly on the offensive side, but defensively as well. So I think that's going to be the big thing. We talked about this last week, and I think it's going to continue to be the big thing, Mark, that Oklahoma has to guard against and play against is how will they be able to compete at the line of scrimmage in the SEC?
That was definitely a theme, and the theme of SEC venues, and
Yep.
that being brought up
Hmm.
both to the OU and Texas side, but also to the rest of the SEC to say, what is OU and Texas? What are they in for? Can you explain to them? I was hearing questions of players and coaches that were completely unrelated to OU and Texas, not even on the schedule that they were
Hmm.
being asked. Somebody was working on their column, but about the venues in the SEC and the shock of being surrounded by 100,000 people that are as rabid as they are.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There was a very comical interview question with Jackson Arnold, specifically talking about that, and he had mentioned over the summer he had spoken to Carson Beck about Jordan Hare Stadium, and Carson Beck basically told him that's that stadium is cursed, right? And so I think cursed from the perspective of I think it's just it's such a much tougher environment than most people will give it credit for. And I think this was one that we talked about last week specifically, Mark, that Auburn may not be necessarily quite as good this year as they've been in the past, and certainly last year not as good as they've been in the past. But ask Alabama how tough of an environment it was last year, right? They almost knocked them out of the playoff hunt. So yeah, and you're right. I think there's a lot of conversation about the venues, and I think I think on one side of it, it's kind of funny. Like Oklahoma and Texas have played in big time environments, right? Both of these schools are blue bloods. It's not anything out of the ordinary. I think when you look at this conversation, not just from a venue perspective, but just holistically, I think that the challenge is going to continue to be week in and week out, going to these venues, playing against these teams, which is something that I think it's just going to both teams are probably going to have a little bit of struggles understand like really conceptualizing what that looks like. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the venues are incredible in the SEC, and I think that the fan bases are probably more rabid in the SEC than they are um, across the country to a certain degree. So yeah, I think that'll be very intriguing to see, and then that'll continue to be a little bit of the narrative I think coming into to this season, especially for Oklahoma and Texas playing some of these teams that they haven't played in the past, and even for other SEC teams coming into Norman, coming into Austin. I've talked to several people that are really excited just to play these incumbent SEC teams just coming to play Oklahoma and Texas. So
I'm not selling this as some kind of exhaustive research to prove a point, but take this for an example. At Jordan Hare Stadium, first of all, this team lost 7 games last year. They were not a very good football team at Auburn, but they had Alabama on the ropes. 4th and 32, 4th and goal from the 32, should have won that game. If it's
mhm.
reasonably defended, they beat Alabama. They knock Alabama uh, out of the playoff. Georgia, that ball game is tied with 4 or 5 minutes left. They're tied with probably the most talented team in the country with 4 or 5 minutes left, and they only lose by a touchdown. If you look at the last decade of Alabama games, I've done this. You could probably go back further and further prove the point. And again, I'm not saying this is exhaustive research against everyone. So I gave the snapshot of 2023, but the last 10 Alabama games, every game. So the last 2 times they've had Alabama at Jordan Hare Stadium, they just flat out should have won the game. And it's not one of those deals that it was a tough game, it was well fought, and they just happened to lose the game. No, it was like they blew the game. The season before the 2021 game, if a runner doesn't run out of bounds, they run out the clock and win the game. And again, Alabama goes to the playoffs because Auburn just, you know, pulls a boneheaded play and their running back runs out of bounds and gives Alabama the ball back. Otherwise, they beat Alabama, a playoff team, at home. They beat Alabama in 2019 at home. They beat them at home in 2017, and all their other losses to Alabama in the last decade at home were excruciating losses. So that's how they performed against Alabama at home. Jason, at Alabama the last decade, they've lost by an average of 4 touchdowns.
Yep.
That's the difference between home and road, at least for Auburn against Alabama and Georgia.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think when we talked about the schedule last week, Mark, we talked about for Oklahoma just to have the season that they want to have, anywhere from 8 to 9 wins. um, this is a game that you circle on the calendar that you say that Oklahoma really needs to win that game, right? With the schedule that they have, particularly the latter half of the season. But no, you're absolutely right. But I think and you've got to expect that players and the fans there's obviously a little bit of a different juice between New Mexico State and Alabama, obviously, right? And I think that was the interesting parallel last year when Auburn lost 31-10 to New Mexico State and then turned around and did exactly what you'd mentioned. But yeah, and you've got to expect this is early in the season. Oklahoma's coming. They will have just hosted Tennessee the week before, and then they go to Auburn. First SEC road game, and this is the one that you get. I think you'd like to have a little bit more of a warm up, but again, I think it's the most interesting thing is I think the narrative, and I don't know that this is all the way across the board. Um, I think it's one of those things, Mark, where the Oklahoma fan base is not quite sure how to react to what's coming. I think there's a lot of comparisons around Auburn, like, okay, it's not that difficult of a place to play. This is not a great team. This would be comparatively going to Kansas or going to BYU or something like that, just in terms of team talent overall. But I think it's going to be maybe a little bit of a shock from a fan perspective that I think maybe the undervalue of the SEC is happening just to a certain degree. Um, but yeah, I mean, I can't wait to watch these games. I can't wait to get it started because it's going to be great football to watch. But yeah, it's Auburn's gonna. I don't have their. I know they play California in the non-conference, but I don't have their schedule in front of me. But they're gonna be amped up. Their crowd's gonna be amped up for the new blood to come to Jordan Hare.
I have not been to a game in the Big 12. I have been to, if we count all sorts of neutral site games, I've been to 5 or 6 different places in the SEC. The thing I'll say is I'm not going to challenge which conference has the more rabid fan base, but if you just look at it this way, let's say the crowds are just as rabid. I know it's difficult to go to Oklahoma State, Kansas State, Iowa State when they're playing well and they're amped. They can get loud. BYU is a tough environment. After that, I think it diminishes quite a bit. But off the top of my head, I might be missing somebody. West Virginia. But if you just equate the difference and say the fan bases are just as rabid, you just equate 55 or 60,000 people at most of those venues to 90 or 100,000 Florida, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, LSU, off the top of my head, all those places are in the 100,000 range.
Yeah.
And Auburn is probably in the 80, 85,000 range off the top of my head. It's just going to be a bit different of a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the one thing that might be a little bit of a benefit for Oklahoma against Auburn is the fact that I believe this is going to be an afternoon game, and it may not necessarily matter, but night games, are a little bit inducing of a better overall environment. But like you said, it may not matter. But yeah, you're right. I mean, and I don't mean to discredit the Big 12, and I don't mean this disparagingly, but like the environments from the Big 12 versus what's going to happen in the SEC is night and day. I mean, I think it's like when you look at Group of Five going to a Power Five or Power Four, I guess now. Um, that's the change, and so I think it's it. like I said, I think someone said this in the yeah, that you have it up there. I think it's good. I think for Oklahoma that they get this out of the way early. They get this environment, understand what this is going to be like because I mean it's going to be a similar experience at Ole Miss. Maybe not to the degree of difficulty that Auburn is, but then Ole Miss is a much better football team coming into this season than what Auburn is, right? And then late in the year, potentially, I mean, you could argue the best home field environment in all of college football in Death Valley at LSU late in the year after Thanksgiving. So, yeah, I think it'll be one of those things that will be fun to watch. Like I said, how Oklahoma handles these environments, particularly with a with a young quarterback. Right early on, you've got his first played in the Alamo Bowl, which was obviously a neutral site game, but this will be his first game on the road as a true sophomore. So just with that and the offensive line, it'll be very, like I said, very interesting to see if Oklahoma can get off to a really good start heading into Dallas.